All right. So volunteer leadership, I've got some questions here for folks. And so again, if you have connection issues, please put things in the chat so that we hear what you have to share and your experiences that we can learn from. So volunteers, some people I know when you hear like volunteers, you're like, yay, this is great. Like we get people that are going to share their time with our organization. And then there are other people who roll their eyes when we hear about volunteers. So I think it very much depends on our context. So to start things off, before I pull the article up with some highlights and things that I would like for us to cover specifically from the reading. It's not an article, it's like a little booklet chapter, but how are volunteers involved in your organization? Either like your paid like staff position, or maybe you're a volunteer yourself in an organization. How are volunteers involved in your organization? I'm going to put that question in the chat too, so we don't get it lost. So a lot of us, that's kind of automatically the board of directors who are supposed to make sure that the organization is fiscally sound and is running well and not in the day-to-day operations of the organization. That's why you have staff members raising funds for the organization. How are volunteers involved in your organizations besides the board of directors? BOD is a big one. Or maybe you are the volunteer and you can share with us what your volunteer role is.
We got a handful of different, it's kind of tiered out into different volunteer positions, but we have a pretty vast AmeriCorps program that I think would fall under volunteer. And then we have a volunteer department that manages things from program volunteers that would come a certain amount of week or a certain amount of times per week to program, mentors that get paired with one of the students involved in the program, and then also like special events, people that would come and film, take pictures at fundraising events. So yeah, I think I'm one of those people that gets a little annoyed handling volunteers, and also we use a lot of volunteers in our organization.
I'm going to ask about those cons in a little bit. So how do you volunteer, or how are volunteers involved in your organization?
So where I'm at, our volunteers are somewhat volunteers, but they're also our like clients, I guess. So like, I don't know how you would, guests. So we have a hospitality house, and so folks come and stay with us and volunteer. So it's like a whole thing. It's like a trip. Like they come, stay for a week, and then we coordinate their volunteer work. So it's pretty much what we do. But I think that it's interesting this past year because we haven't had those capacity to come and like stay with us. And so we are realizing that we don't have, like we have a lot that needs to get done, and we really do rely on our volunteers. So like without those groups coming and, you know, staying for a few days from out of town, we don't have a lot of local volunteers. So we have like all of a sudden have all these projects that need done. And we're like, oh, we have to like hire somebody to do this stuff.
Is it like voluntourism?
We call them like service trips or like retreats. It depends on the group. Most of them have been coming for years, so like we know them at this point, but still they travel from elsewhere. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And Casey, you asked a really good question, because I think if you have a donor that doesn't get involved, like I would say someone who donates to like NPR and listens, that donor I wouldn't consider a volunteer. But what I do find is that volunteers make your best donors. And so I think there is a lot of controversy, probably isn't the right word, but disagreement around asking volunteers for money, because a lot of people feel like, well, if you're volunteering with the organization, so you're giving of your time, oh my gosh, like on top of that, your talent, which we kind of expect from our board of directors, but say from a volunteer that comes at a food bank and sorts food a couple hours a week, people get very uncomfortable with the idea of asking those folks to also donate money, not, in addition to their time.
Well, in Bhutan, especially in my organization, we have a project which is not exactly my organization's project, but then we also have a group of volunteers. Actually, I happen to be the country coordinator for the Bhutan Water Partnership. It's just a country office from the Global Water Partnership, but the volunteers, actually the steering committee members of the Bhutan Water Partnerships are all volunteers from different organizations. Although we carefully choose to choose the volunteers from the relevant organizations, but then they are not paid. They actually they are a steering committee member without being paid, but we also implement projects. We actually write proposals, seek donations from organizations, and then implement some small scale water projects in some water stressed communities. So yes, that is one thing. The other thing is we also, in my own organization, which is Royal Society for Protection of Nature, it's a member-based organization, and we have a lot of volunteers actually volunteering not only from in-country, but we also have volunteers coming from outside the country, especially from Europe and America. And we in the past few years, we had a lot of volunteers working with us. One example is we had actually just established a library, which is called the Environment. Actually, it's a research library, and we had no expertise within Bhutan who could actually establish a library of that kind. It is the first of its kind. It's an environmental library. We have all the books from environmental organizations. So we had a volunteer from the Parliament of Canada. Her name was Aurel, and she worked with us for 3 years. She volunteered with us for 3 years, and she has actually established this library, and now we are running it on our own, but she has volunteered. So we get volunteers from not only within Bhutan, we also get volunteers from outside the country.
Awesome. And Gunjan shared that in their organization, volunteers are from the local community, but we also call them as social entrepreneurs. That's very interesting. So are they getting compensated in some way, or do they get like an opportunity to sell like a product or a service that would make them kind of your traditional entrepreneur?
Yes, I mean, so the organization do not pay them, but then they get paid for selling the products.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And they get to keep all of those funds that they sell the items
Yes,
from?
yes.
Huh.
Yes. So, like the organization provide them. So we are like giving them, contraceptions with in subsidized rates, and then they sell it to, like, we have set the margin for them, and then they sell it to the local women and men from the community. So, like, they have to buy from the organization, and then but in a subsidized rate, and then they have to sell it to women.
Huh. It's interesting that you all set the margins for them.
Yes.
Very interesting. So there was a part in the article or the reading that I want to pull up and share with you. Because this has been a long time kind of, not, I guess, kind of battle discussion that your top leadership, so like say an executive director, your board of directors, say you're all volunteer run, that kind of lead volunteer at the top has to be right here really in favor or support the idea of volunteerism, and that volunteers should be incorporated into the program, incorporated into the work. So why would it be important for your top leadership levels to be supportive of volunteers in your organization? Especially if it's a new concept for your organization, like, oh, we should involve volunteers. Why would it be important for that top leadership to really give their approval? And I'll put that question in the chat too. Why would it be important for top leadership?
I think because your volunteers are one of your biggest supporters, and they could literally make or break your organization. If they're having a good positive experience and they feel like they are really contributing to the organization, they're going to go recruit people on your organization's behalf, compared to those unfortunate events where volunteers do not feel that they are appreciated or that their time is being valued. They are not going to help your organization grow and develop at all. So I think it's essential for your top leadership to continue to invest in volunteers and volunteer development.
Awesome.
Kind of to go off what Casey said, when your volunteers are supported and they do go out and recruit people, they're also like free advertisement for your company, for your organization, because not only are they getting other people to come volunteer as well, but they're also spreading the word about your organization, about like your mission, your goals, what you're doing, and keeping people up to date and like in touch with others. So they're definitely a really good driving force to, like she was saying, make or break what you guys are doing.
And Daniel, you got some volunteers doing some pretty important work there. It sounds like peacekeeping, getting volunteers to do peacekeeping. It's amazing. And all of your upper leadership or volunteer. Any other kind of takes as to why your key leadership should be supportive of volunteers?
I think within any community decision or organization, that enabling environment is really key for things to kind of run smoothly. And so with any decision, if you don't have that support, it's just going to be more of a struggle. So like saying, oh, we want to make these volunteers helpful or useful or, you know, enjoyable, and somebody disagrees or doesn't care, there's going to be like some sort of pushback or like more time spent on like, yeah, I don't know. I can see that happening and just giving up, being like, all right, whatever, never mind.
Mm-hmm. So without kind of approval or promotion, it could generate apathy.
Yeah.
And Amir sharing that their role is important to support and guide the management. Absolutely. The other thing with top leadership, if they're not very vocal about the importance of volunteers and including them in the day-to-day work and the mission of the organization, staff can get very protective of work. You know, for those of us that are in a paid role in which we're utilizing volunteers, there's, even when it's a supported, you know, effort to bring volunteers in, and it's even sometimes said, hey, volunteers are not here to replace staff. It drives me a little mad whenever I see in like grant applications or either staff or board saying, well, if we get a volunteer in, that'll solve our staffing problems. And it doesn't. You know, from what you all have shared here too in the chat, you're relying heavily on volunteers to do that work, and that's amazing. But we certainly don't put volunteers in as a replacement of staff. In some instances, there may be other times where it's appropriate, but that is, I think, one of the key problems for a lot of staff members is when volunteer roles are promoted, that may be seen as, oh, well, I'm going to lose my job. So it really does have to come from top leadership, several different aspects, right? That volunteers are a necessary resource, that they supplement, not replace, paid staff in many instances where it's appropriate, and that volunteers work hand in hand in partnership to accomplish the mission, right? So that is the message that key leadership has to share, and of course, kind of keep driving home as a reminder, because we forget that volunteers are a resource, and sometimes, like in Matt's case, a necessary component of the program. When you've got mentors in Girl Scouts, all of the trainers are volunteer, and so they're the ones that are teaching new volunteers how to be a troop leader, how to take your kids camping, how to run the program. Without that level of involvement, you may not have a program, you may not have an effort in your organization. So in your organization, there was this interesting part in the reading as well that I always find interesting, and you can give me your take on this, because from a lot of what's been shared in the chat, and this may be situational, this may be culture-based or country-based or even regional, that volunteers are equal partners with paid staff. So in your organization, do you see volunteers as a true equal partner, doing work that is necessary for improving or expanding services? Do you see volunteers as an equal partner? And you can disagree with this, agree with it, and share why either way. I don't think answers are incorrect here of, don't see them as equal partners, or yes, I do. I'll put that in the chat too.
Yeah, I would agree. They are 1,000% equal partners. Again, because they're having to buy into your organization and what that organization values and what they're trying to do with whatever community. So they're working just as much as your staff is to continue that mission and continue that growth, because they find that value in the organization.
Thanks, Casey. So that's that other part that Ivy mentioned of the free advertising, right? When I have a positive experience, I'm going to tell other people that they need to be involved in the organization.
I wonder, in what ways they would be equal partners, because I'm not really sure if volunteers always understand the full scope, because it's short term or, infrequent. I don't know about that. Maybe, Casey, what ways are they equal partners in your organization? They don't make the same decision. I don't know. Tell me, I would like to hear more about that.
The first thing I think of is that they are also they're buying into what you're selling. So they are essentially, what's the word I'm trying to say? An investor. They are an investor in your organization, whether they are providing monetary value or physical labor, that they are investing in your organization. So although that they may not be a paid employee, but they're having to invest something to see either they find value in what the organization is doing, or they're providing value to that individual or whatever that individual is a part of. So I see it as an investor side, not necessarily in any other way. Does that make sense, Grace? Or
Well, and I see your point too there, Grace, of I think it does depend on the role. Because if you've got a long-term volunteer, let's say a board of directors member or a committee member, they may have a 2 to 3 year commitment that they have anticipated. Whereas if you have someone who's doing a micro volunteer, let's say you've got an event coming up and you've asked people to, or maybe you haven't even asked, it's just kind of a soft ask on your social media to say, hey, forward this to anybody that you think is interested, or we've got an info session on this, join us at 2:00. Very micro defined volunteer opportunities where, yes, I'm invested in the mission, I believe in the organization, but I'm doing like a maybe 30-second click, share, make a comment, and I'm done with that one volunteer involvement. Now, if I say go to an in-person event and volunteer 2 hours shift to hand out materials, or to involve youth in an event, however that works, that's a little bit different. So I think the more involvement that's expected, the more the equal partnership, like Casey mentioned, of you're invested, you're there, you show up every month, you give typically time and talent and treasure to the organization because you're that invested. That's how I kind of see some of the equal partner stuff. And the equal partner relationship that really sticks out for me is when you have a board chair and an executive director. They have to work hand in glove to make an organization run. Like, so much so that as an executive director, I talk to my board chair every week. It was like a scheduled thing, same time every week. Sometimes we canceled it if we didn't need to talk, like if we had just had a board meeting or something, we knew what was going on, but a weekly catch up to say, or sometimes it was every 2 weeks, because every week can be a little nauseating, but an equal partner in making sure that everything is getting done. Other takes on that equal partner piece. And Herman made a comment. I want to make sure we mention these two. Volunteer recruitment is important for nonprofit work as we're doing now for the community lab assignments. Absolutely. They help us in any number of ways. So I know a lot of you are taking the research course right now and getting folks to participate in that. And in Amir's context, this is awesome. They're the real owner of the organization. The board is volunteer in our organization, and they have a role to pass all of the regulations and statutes. Yeah, absolutely. Policy, procedures, bylaws. I know it's not like pretty, right? It's not the headlining kind of stuff, but it's certainly important. It has to happen, right? And Fabienne mentions that for their organization or her organization, because they are part of the board and are members of the organization and part of the network. So very much involved in the day-to-day work and making sure that the mission moves forward, to which they're seen as equal partners. Absolutely. So my biggest takeaway from that, though, is the level of work that they're doing. If it is that micro volunteer or a single event that you've got somebody involved, that equal partner may not necessarily be a thing, right? But if I've got somebody committed for a year in a mentor role, that may be a very different kind of perspective of equal partner. Other takes on that equal partner?
I kind of had a question. Oh, go ahead, Matt. I
Yeah.
don't want to question. It changes the
I was just gonna, I don't know. I think it's definitely a both and statement to say this, and just thinking within my organization, like the board of directors is not treated the same as those micro volunteers, and I think even within the staff positions of our organization, there's not an equal partnership, and I think that's recognized within our organization from a program director saying to a program coordinator, like, this isn't your job description, don't do this, I'll do this. So I think, I don't know, I see maybe in a perfect world that there would be some equal partnership, but then I also think about, for us, when we're working with, when the youth are the main piece of our organization, I don't know that it should be equal. And if it were equal, would that be enabling growth for the population we're working with?
I think from the volunteer perspective, that equal piece, and yeah, some roles may not be appropriate for seen as equal, but I think there is a piece, at least for a while there, especially like in 2008, when we saw a crash in the US, so many people lost their job. A big part of kind of that job loss were people saying, well, in the meantime, until you can find yourself a paid role, volunteer your time and expertise, in which volunteers wanted to be considered that equal partner because they were using it as kind of a stopgap. Like, okay, there's a gap in my employment, but I'm going to show a future employer that I've been keeping up these skills, that I have been participating as a volunteer in this organization, whether it's like 20 hours a week or 10 or something like that, to show an employer. That was a huge thing of the benefit of keeping it on your resume as a volunteer role in between employment. Not so much, I think, anymore. And it might be this year or the year coming up, just with COVID and everything else and people losing their job. What did you do in between? But a huge part about 10 years ago. What was your question, Grace?
Yeah, I didn't want to change the subject, but I think it kind of goes with what Matt was saying. When we have board members who, in theory, are committed for years. I mean, our organization, you can I think it's 3-year terms with an unlimited amount of renewals. So I have people on the board who've been on the board, they've been on the board for like 20 years.
Nope.
They really care. But like, I don't talk to them ever. Like every 4 months, we hop on a Zoom call. So I guess that kind of comes to where, like, what are our roles? I guess talking about, like, from this article about how to re-engage volunteers and how to spend time on that, whose role is that? Like, is it up to staff to kind of, like, re-engage the board? Because I'm always like, they're my boss, they're not doing what they need to be doing, so I'm just going to do what I need to do. And, like, I get, like, what, like, I'm like, whatever. I don't want to spend, like, it's hard to balance spending time re-engaging your board of directors when there's so many other things that need done. I don't know if there's an answer, but that's just kind of like, whose role is that, and how do we build off of each other to bring, I don't know.
And a lot of it's personality too. So, that really, at least in terms of engaging boards or board members, that really falls to not as you as say like program staff or finance, HR, whoever. That is really incumbent upon your board chair as a peer and your executive director, whoever that senior staff person is, that the board is working hand in glove with. So I would see from like my, when I was an ED, my marketing manager, for example, it was not her job or part of her job to get board members engaged. However, when it came to, say, the marketing committee, she was the key staff person to say, well, you don't need to be posting on our behalf, but please do share certain posts or our articles on our website or our events, and encouraging them to do that. There is this kind of crazy fine line with getting staff engaged with a board member for a specific project and board members overstepping their bounds and telling a staff member what to do. Because what a staff member does day to day actually should not be coming from the board. It comes from the senior staff person charged with the responsibility to oversee staff. So there is a very weird relationship there of, well, say as a program manager or coordinator, I really want my board members engaged, but that really falls to that senior staff, executive director, whatever they are, and a board chair, and really the board chair pushing board members to be engaged, to do more than their quarterly board meeting, whether that's with committee work or a particular project that they work with staff on. But there really shouldn't be a lot of pressure put on someone who is doing the day-to-day work to also engage the board, unless you've got a board member who's very passionate about a particular project and they really want to help you out, take some of the tasks off, as long as it doesn't turn into a boundary issue and telling you what to do in your job. Which hopefully it hasn't been that, but it happens, right?
You should teach a class about like board relations, and we'll take that. This is a whole semester's worth of information.
It really is, because a board, when it comes to leadership, have their own charge, right? They are, at a bare minimum, charged with fiduciary duties of the organization and making sure that the organization is fiscally sound, bare minimum, right? Going above that being what we expect board members to do: recruit board members, donate to the organization, be involved on committees, sell tickets to our events, be our spokesperson, be our buzz, right? They're the ones bringing other folks into the organization because of their passion for the mission. As soon as you have a board member that is either time starved and they don't have time to be passionate about the mission, or they just kind of lose interest, which happens too. We do that as well. We lose interest in what we're involved in. Then they really no longer serve in that function and should leave, right? I have a board right now that I sit on and I'm like, I don't enjoy this organization anymore. I'm not engaged by other board members. The CEO has not talked to me in over a year. I'm giving them a monthly contribution, and as part of my board service, I'm also required to make an annual contribution to our endowment fund. And at this point, I'm like, I don't care anymore. So it waxes and wanes both the same way with board members. You get some that are really gung-ho, others that overstep their bounds and tell staff what to do when that's not their role. And then others that are like, I gave my time and I'm kind of over it. But what you should not have, which is what you're experiencing, is someone that's been on the board for 20 years. That is not what's supposed to happen. Just FYI, you can tell them, Dr. Erica said, you should change this. Blame it on me and say, okay, yeah, you can have 3-year terms, but you get a max of 2 terms. And then you can go away for a year, participate in other ways, and come back if you'd like. But you don't get to stick around for 20 years. You certainly can have different roles, but you're not supposed to be on the board for 20 years. Blame it on me.
I can't tell them anything, but I'll see how it goes. We have a board meeting next Friday, so it's all going through my head.
So
everything I need
for 20 years. Yeah. And then there's other times where people are around for 20 years because no one else is stepping up, but then other people don't step up because somebody's been around for 20 years and they're just going to do it anyway. It's a very hot topic for me. Board members shouldn't be around for 20 years. They suck all the energy out of the room. It's like, And then the only way to get rid of them, to make sure that they're not on the board, is that they die. Like, there is that kind of person on the board of a lot of organizations, and you just have to wait for them to pass. Like, they're not going to step away, and they're going to be the no vote to change any of the policies. And that's poor fiscal management, poor governance. Yes, and Matt, you are correct. Not all volunteers are joining with the same goals or mission in mind. Some people can be very self-serving. They're volunteering with this organization because they want something out of it, which I think with the passing of, at least in the US, Sarbanes-Oxley, and a level of ethics. I mean, this was all because of the crash in 2008, that there were additional rules and regulations from the federal government to say a board of directors should do this, and then other things have to do this, right? That was the whole thing. Well, that applied to nonprofit boards of directors just as much as it did corporate boards of public and private corporations. So then there was this kind of change in expectation, like you have to do this, 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 and this as a board member. So the expectation changed, and there have been some organizations that are very slow to accept those changes, but the standard of kind of operating procedure, if you will, for nonprofit boards is XYZ. And so with that, it's been harder for people to join boards in the US with their own personal agenda. So if I say own a construction company, and my kind of end game in my head is I'm going to join the board of this organization because I want the construction contract for the building that I know that they need built in the next 6 months. Well, with new guidelines and requirements in place, that can't happen. Self-dealing at arm's length. And even if you had, say, someone that abstained from a vote to get a contract, let's say for a building, it still doesn't look good, right? The optics are bad. If and if it's a 501c3, minutes of that organization, unless they went into executive session, are public record. Someone can come and ask for your board meeting minutes and how decisions were voted on, yes or no, doesn't matter. Like out of 12 people, 10 voted yes and 2 voted no. They don't have to go in that level of detail, but those decisions can be open to scrutiny. And so thankfully, the idea that somebody would come, and this is of course the extreme, right, Matt? Like that people would come with their own agenda. It's harder for them to make good on that agenda with what changed in 08 to 2010, somewhere around there. I'll get off my soapbox about boards now. I could go on. So kind of last couple questions here in our last 14 minutes. Any areas you intentionally have not involved volunteers, like areas of work? And I'll put this in the chat too. Any areas of work that you have intentionally not involved volunteers? And why? You want to share why? Like, we don't have volunteers do XYZ because.
Our organization doesn't currently require volunteers as we're considered a quasi-government. But the first, I was a volunteer coordinator, the first job out of college. And I remember I purposely did not place anybody in the finance department just because of the disclosure stuff. Although are all of the volunteers required to sign a non-disclosure, but the director and I had both made the call not to place people in the finance department.
Good one. No finance. Don't get to look at the checkbook. Any other areas that you have intentionally not put volunteers?
I think for us, there's only like one thing I can think of, and that's for like underage volunteers. We don't let them drive other people. But if you're an adult volunteer, go for it, you know? I think that has to do with insurance and, you know. signing off on stuff.
Yeah, I learned with renting a 15-passenger van, if you're under the age, or at least it used to be under the age of 25, you couldn't drive a 15-passenger van. Who would have thought?
Pretty sure I did that, but maybe maybe illegally.
What other areas have you intentionally not put volunteers in? Any that folks would like to share?
We stayed pretty clear of them this past year, as majority of it was online, and I think just motivation and jumping out of comfort zones wasn't all that desirable from the students' perspective. So, and also we anticipated us having to facilitate that space. So at that point, it was kind of like we could sit with the student online as a trusted adult and work with the student, instead of sitting with the volunteer and the student.
Mm-hmm.
Just, yeah. So we opted out of using volunteers this past year.
Well, hopefully they come back.
Yeah, that was we had, at least for our particular program, we had a pretty strong base of a good 3 or 4 volunteers that had stuck with us the last, I don't know, 3 years. So there was some consistency, and I think they were kind of on the same boat of like, yeah, I'm good with the break, and I think they had intentions in coming back. So I think that also played a role in us being a little more comfortable with the decision.
And Casey, you bring up a good point with the background checks with clients. There are certain organizations, especially ones that work with kids, where nobody gets to volunteer without a background check. One organization I volunteer with, I work exclusively with adults that work with kids, and I still have to have a background check to work with the adults. For organizations that have say a quote big enough budget, so the level that I consider that is around like $1 million, maybe $750,000, that at least have staff, not all volunteer run. I have suggested to those organizations that one area that they don't bring in volunteers is website and social, because it requires consistency, right? Doesn't matter if you give them like a Hootsuite account and say, hey, write posts for the next month. That still is a lot of need for internal knowledge and know what's going on and having a lot of information. Plus, either admin access or passwords to social and your website. I've seen where organizations have given the website to a volunteer, and then that volunteer walks away and they can't even log in to change their website. I've seen volunteers like post inappropriate things for an organization on their behalf because they're charged with social, and then they get jaded or upset or don't think something worked right when they're not the ones that are involved in the decision making, and then wreak havoc because they have access to social media. So that has been my one area, aside from finance that Casey has brought up, that you just don't involve volunteers. There might be the opportunity for volunteers to share content or make a recommendation like, hey, this is a great article related to our work. Hey, so-and-so social media coordinator, you might think about posting this. I thought it was very interesting. I think, people involved in our organization might find it interesting as well. But I just don't, unless it's an all volunteer organization, I just don't put volunteers in that kind of role. And it also can be very overwhelming to where volunteers like, you know what, after a couple months, I'm a little done. I'm out. So yeah, that's my one where I don't put volunteers. And then other areas I haven't put anybody with a criminal background, say access to vehicles, access to money, Sometimes we turn away a volunteer depending on what they like. Obviously, I'm not going to take somebody who is a registered sex offender to work with children. That's kind of the underage, that's like a threshold. And I work for organizations where we rely on giving people second chances and getting people back into employment where they're a productive member of society, have a job, are able to get their own housing. So I hate to say, like, I'm going to hold somebody back because they have a criminal background. In some things, it's totally acceptable. If somebody has, say, like a possession charge on their criminal background, if they want to do like stocking in a food pantry, if they want to take animals for a walk, that is not a problem. It's usually when youth are involved, I get a little kind of sticky about criminal backgrounds. It's my only area of concern.
Yeah, I agree, Erica. I had this one guy, he was really honest about it. He told me when he came in, I was like, we are gonna have to do a background check. He was like, don't bother. He said, it's gonna come back terrible. He said, and I completely understand. I'm more than willing to do like custodial work. So we made it his schedule out to be where our clients weren't in the building, so we could go do custodial work for us, just to have that as on his resume that he was still volunteering and trying to be a active member in society. So I think that's the fun part, is helping people get back into whatever worked for them and works for the organization.
And there's flexibility there, right? Like there may be roles or areas or times of the day where you may not be able to involve a volunteer, but being flexible with what you can do job-wise or responsibility-wise is, I think, appreciated too, where we get people involved that might not otherwise have an opportunity to be involved with our organization.
It's actually funny because where I used to live, there was it was a thrift store linked to a nonprofit organization, Habitat for Humanity. There it is. It was Habitat for Humanity. I always forget the name. And
like Restore?
Yes. But they had like a thrift store and a food bank in the back. It was really interesting setup. But there were like one person manned the thrift store, another person, like two other people were in charge of like the food bank and the other stuff as well. So it was really like a 3-person operating system, but it was a tiny town, so it kind of worked out. And I just started volunteering there, and I ended up being the only volunteer who was not there to do their community service time. And so I ended up organizing and training the community service members. And we did like a whole, like, go through the entire store, organize it, clean it. And every day I came in and they were just like, okay, well, you do your thing. And okay. And so my volunteer was basically like, to organize the community service members. And most of them were really cool. I mean, it was really interesting talking to them because like one guy was there, and I think oddly enough, he was there for possession. And he told me, he's like, yeah, I got caught with drugs. And I was like, okay, but like the more we talked, like he was just super interested in like reading and science and math and books. And so I had him in charge of the books, you know? So it was interesting. That was like my experience with community service members, was volunteering with them and like just talking to them, getting to know them, definitely shifted my perception of them and like people who do crimes in general. I don't know, I feel like society just kind of leads people to believe that bad people do crimes when it's just people, period, do crimes. Like it's good and bad people do crimes. And unfortunately, where I was at, like a lot of people did really petty things out of boredom. Like, I mean,
Or necessity
too.
Some people do illegal things out of
income.
necessity.
Like, oh, I can't get a job except working at a factory here. So what do? You know what? Selling drugs is really easy, really quick thing to get into, and literally everyone here is buying. So like, I mean, I don't know. I think it's interesting that you guys bring up people with a criminal record, because those were the people that I was volunteering with.
Which, so for our non-US folks, I think, so somebody correct me if they are experience differently or know differently. I think the idea of required community service as part of rehabilitation or in lieu of sentencing is a uniquely American thing, like required community service. But I'm not sure. So somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's uniquely American. But I don't know. I'm not sure. Well, so I think this has been a very interesting conversation around use of volunteers. And as you think about how you integrate volunteers into your organization or include additional opportunities or what have you, think about the trends that you're seeing with volunteer work. What are people interested in doing? And I think what you're going to find, and micro volunteering is not a new thing. That has been around for at least the past decade, as far as I can remember, where we give people pretty short volunteer assignments. So I don't see that trend going anywhere. But I think more people are looking for what are those volunteer opportunities I can do that don't involve me going somewhere. Like I can do from home or go pick up something, put it together and bring it back. So, think about what trends you are seeing and what is possible for your organization. How can you change the face of volunteerism, especially COVID's not going anywhere. It's a little different in all of our circumstances. How can people be involved in light of COVID? So kind of get creative as you go along in your organization, working with volunteers and use those trends to your advantage. So I will see you all back here for our last session. I'm kind of moving some points around and stuff to make the most out of our session next week. Really hope that everybody can join us, and I will be asking you about some personal leadership experiences and the things that you can take away from this class. So I will see you here again next week. And I'll be grading your all's lab assignments as quickly as possible. I'd like to have your all's grades for those done before next Monday. See y'all.
So I actually have a question about our last lab assignment. Are you going to go over more information about it next session?
Thanks, Herman. Have a good one.
Yeah, good morning, Dr. Erica. I sent you my email
I got
asking some questions. Please review my assignment draft, please.
Sure thing.
Okay, I will wait in order to complete my assignment.
Okay.
Thank you, Erica. See you.
I'll get that back to you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
So what was your question, Ivy?
Oh, are we gonna go over, I guess, what the last lab assignment is?
You mean the third one? I'm
Yes.
canceling it.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, I'm going to cancel it and I'm going to move points around for your all's attendance and participation.
Okay, gotcha.
No more to do.
Yeah, let's just.
It's what I'm saying.
Because like what I ended up doing is I have had my second lab assignment done for the past like 3 weeks. I don't know why. I thought it was due super early. And so I did it and I finished it. And then I realized I turned it in late because I thought it was due the 24th for some reason. And I went to turn it in because like, I don't know, our last assignment was due like, I think like on the day before or on the day of class. And that's what really confused me. And so I went to turn it in last night, like, oh yeah, let me go ahead and get it in before it's due tomorrow. And then I looked at it, it was like late by 21 hours. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've had it done for like
You're fine.
already.
Because I get the same, like, depending on the time zone, some people get confused anyway. So I wouldn't worry about it. The, what was I gonna tell you? So the day, like day of the week wise, I was trying to navigate amongst all of the due dates that I know you all had for other classes this semester. So that's why it was kind of a weird day of the week. So you all didn't have assignments due on the same day.
Ah, okay. Gotcha.
Yep.
Yeah. I felt so dumb. Like I've just had it done,
It
just
happens.
sitting there this whole time. I still had it late. Like, how does it happen?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That was all I had. But glad we don't have a last lab.
Yeah.
Although the inventories were a lot. I was not expecting that at all.
Yeah. Well, and it was going to be like a personal leadership statement. And that's where I'm like, between your second lab and discussion next week, I think that kind of covers what most people would have said anyway. So that's why I was like, you know what, I'm going to move those points somewhere else where I know you all already like can use them or you all have excelled in. So.
Okay, gotcha. Well, thank you.
Sure thing.
Have a good weekend.
You too.